Alice had thought the jungle was beautiful. Endless emerald canopies, sunlight slicing through mist in golden slivers, the symphony of birds, insects, and distant waterfalls. It had called to her with a wild, unbroken song. But that was before the path had vanished beneath her feet, before the river had swallowed the trail behind her, and before she had realized she was utterly alone in a land that had no mercy for outsiders. The Mangole territory was whispered about in hushed tones even in distant towns. Stories told by traders and wandering travelers spoke of a tribe so remote, so feral, that even the wind seemed afraid to whistle through the forest where they lived. Alice had brushed them off as superstition. She was an adventurer, after all, curious, fearless, determined. But curiosity, she would soon learn, could be a dangerous companion. She had wandered for hours after losing the faint trail that had guided her from the village on the edge of the jungle. The sun had dipped low, bleeding red behind the trees, and an uneasy silence had fallen over the forest. Birds that had chirped and flitted by all day had gone quiet, as if they had sensed the approaching danger. Shadows stretched long across the ground, writhing like dark fingers reaching for her. It was then that she heard the first sound, a low guttural chant, not the song of the forest but human, ancient, rhythmic, and frighteningly alien. Her heart thumped violently in her chest. She froze, straining to see through the thick undergrowth. Shapes moved between the trees, swift and silent, until the chanting resolved into a cluster of figures gathered in a clearing ahead. The tribe, the Mangole, was real, and they were nothing like she had imagined. They were tall, sinewy, their skin painted with streaks of earth and ash, their eyes sharp and assessing, watching her every move. The firelight from their circle danced across their faces, making them appear almost otherworldly. There was no welcoming smile, no gesture of peace, only piercing, silent scrutiny. Alice's instincts screamed at her to retreat, to vanish into the shadows, but every direction seemed to twist back into the dense, suffocating jungle. Panic began to rise like ice water through her veins. She moved slowly, cautiously, trying not to make a sound, but the undergrowth betrayed her, snapping twigs beneath her feet. The chant stopped abruptly. The forest held its breath. Figures emerged from the shadows like predators, circling her. Every movement was deliberate, measured. Alice felt their eyes like sharp blades, cutting into her, weighing her, judging her. Her mind raced. She was trapped, utterly exposed, a stranger in a place where every instinct for safety was meaningless. She remembered a story she had read once about travelers who had vanished in these jungles, never to be seen again. Tales of people being captured, taken to live among the tribe, and then disappearing into legend. Fear rooted her to the spot, cold and absolute. The tribe did not attack immediately. Instead, they studied her. The leader, or at least the one who seemed to command attention, stepped forward. His face was stern, painted with a pattern of white streaks that glowed faintly in the firelight. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was an intelligence there, sharp and wary. He gestured for Alice to move closer. Alice wanted to scream, to run, to resist, but she was paralyzed. There was no escape. Her limbs felt heavy, like they had turned to lead. Step by step, she walked toward them, every nerve screaming in protest. The clearing was alive with tension. Shadows twisted around her, carried by the flickering fire. The air was thick, hot, and pungent with the scent of earth, smoke, and sweat. She felt the tribe's gaze everywhere, their silent presence pressing down on her as if the forest itself were conspiring to trap her. The leader spoke, in a language that sounded like a low rumble vibrating from the earth itself. Alice could not understand, yet she felt the weight of the words, as though every syllable was a command, a warning, a promise. Other members of the tribe closed the circle, their movements deliberate, silent, predatory. Night descended fully then. The jungle transformed into a living entity. The chirping of insects became deafening, interspersed with the distant cries of unknown creatures. Every rustle, every snapping branch made her heart leap. She knew instinctively that the Mangole could strike without warning. She was a lone human, fragile, in a world that had no place for her. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to lose meaning before they finally spoke again. This time, their voices were closer, sharper. Commands, threats, and laughter that Alice could not comprehend. But she knew exactly what they meant. She understood without words. She was trapped, alone, at their mercy. Her first night among the Mangole was spent crouched under a dense canopy, hidden yet painfully aware that eyes followed her every move. Sleep came only in short, terrified bursts. She could hear them moving through the jungle, their chants echoing faintly, as though the forest itself carried their presence to her hiding place. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of leaves, made her flinch, heartsick with fear. Alice realized then the truth of the forest. Survival was not about fighting, it was about enduring, watching, waiting, hiding, and somehow, she had to find a way out of a place that did not want her alive. Her journey had begun, and the jungle was watching. Night had a weight in the Mangole territory, thick and suffocating, as if the darkness itself were alive. Alice crouched beneath the tangle of vines, the damp earth pressing against her palms, her back leaning against a massive tree trunk. Her entire body ached from hours of hiding, from the terror that had rooted her limbs in place. But the worst part wasn't the ache or the hunger gnawing at her stomach. It was the knowledge that the tribe was out there, somewhere in the darkness, moving with silent, deliberate steps. The forest had become a predator. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed magnified. Every small sound Alice made felt like a thunderclap to the unseen eyes tracking her. The Mangole moved like shadows, blending into the blackness so perfectly she often thought she imagined their presence. Until the laughter, low and guttural, drifted through the trees. That sound froze her blood, a chilling mixture of amusement and menace. She remembered the fire from earlier in the day. The leader's face, painted in streaks of ash and white, had been almost inhuman under the flickering light. Now, without the fire, the forest swallowed him and his tribe entirely. They could be anywhere. Alice shivered. The wind carried whispers, or perhaps she imagined them, voices tangled with the rustling leaves, echoing in her mind with impossible clarity. She couldn't tell where the forest ended and the tribe began. Hours crawled by, and the jungle's eerie nocturnal symphony intensified. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard movement. Careful, measured footsteps, circling her hiding spot. Her heart thudded violently, threatening to betray her presence. The shadows shifted unnaturally, and she could have sworn she saw figures watching from behind tree trunks, from above, from every angle. The Mangole were masters of the night. Their hunting skills didn't rely on brute strength. They relied on fear, and Alice was their prey. Suddenly, a branch snapped closer than she expected. Her breath caught in her throat. She froze, eyes wide, straining to see through the darkness. The snapping continued, deliberate like a predator testing the waters. Her imagination ran wild. Was it one of the tribe, or a wild animal drawn to the scent of fear? The answer didn't matter. She was terrified enough that even the thought of movement made her tremble. Then came the chanting. Low, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Alice felt the vibrations through the ground beneath her hands, through the soles of her feet. It wasn't far, but it wasn't near enough to locate precisely. It surrounded her, creeping through the shadows like smoke. She understood immediately. They weren't just hunting her. They were toying with her, learning her patterns, sensing her panic. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but the darkness was thick, the forest treacherous, and she had nowhere safe to go. As minutes stretched into hours, exhaustion began to claim her. Every muscle trembled with the effort of staying silent, every nerve raw from tension. Sleep hovered dangerously at the edge of her consciousness, yet she knew the slightest lapse could mean discovery. She tried to quiet her mind, to focus on the rhythm of her breathing, but the forest refused to let her rest. Shadows moved too quickly, whispers pressed against her ears, and the faint crunch of footsteps circled ever closer. Then she heard it, a whisper, human and guttural, coming from just a few meters away. Her stomach knotted. The voice wasn't speaking a language she understood, but it carried threat and amusement in equal measure. She had no doubt now that the tribe had found her general location, and as she pressed herself flat against the earth, heart hammering, she realized that escaping the night was far more dangerous than being trapped in the day. A sudden movement, a figure stepping into the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy, made her gasp. For a brief, horrifying moment, she could see him. A young Mangole warrior, tall, lithe, painted in the same ceremonial patterns as the leader. His eyes glimmered in the dim light, calculating and alert. He paused, then crouched, moving with predatory precision through the underbrush. Alice held her breath, praying he wouldn't hear the trembling of her body. The jungle seemed to close around her, suffocating. Every leaf, every branch became an obstacle. Every shadow seemed alive. She realized with stark clarity that the tribe didn't need to touch her to terrify her. Their presence alone, their silent observation, and the constant psychological pressure was enough to break the strongest will. And her will, fragile and terrified, was teetering on the edge. Hours passed, and dawn remained stubbornly out of reach. Alice's body ached. Hunger clawed at her stomach, and the weight of fear pressed down like a physical force. Yet in the midst of the terror, a sliver of survival instinct emerged. She knew she couldn't remain paralyzed forever. She needed to move, to find water, to hide more effectively. But how could she navigate a forest that seemed alive with hunters, where even the air whispered threats in a language she didn't understand? And then she realized something that chilled her more than the footsteps or the whispers. The tribe had been here long before her, longer than she could imagine. They knew the forest better than the forest knew itself. She had no chance of outrunning them, not in strength, not in skill. Only cunning, only silence, only patience could save her. And so, crouched in the damp undergrowth, Alice waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the low hum of the jungle and the subtle movements of the Mangole in the darkness. She didn't know if she would see another sunrise. She didn't know if she would live to tell her story. But one thing was certain. Her life had become a waking nightmare, and the jungle, with its shadows and whispers, had claimed her entirely. The jungle had changed. Night now came as an oppressive weight, a living entity that pressed in from all sides. Alice could feel it crawling along her skin, crawling into her lungs, as though the darkness itself sought to claim her. The Mangole were no longer merely observers. They had become shadows, a presence she could sense even when she couldn't see them. Every rustle of leaves, every subtle snap of a branch, set her nerves on fire. She had moved cautiously that night, slipping through dense undergrowth, trying to put distance between herself and the clearing where she had first encountered them. But the forest betrayed her. Roots snagged her feet, vines clutched at her arms, and the thick, choking humidity stole her breath. It was as if the jungle itself were alive, guiding the Mangole to her hiding places, whispering secrets about her location in a language only the hunters understood. Then she felt it. Eyes in the dark, dozens of them, watching her. They weren't hunting her with weapons yet. That would be too obvious. No, they were hunting her with fear, pressing against her mind, studying her terror. Every step she took was accompanied by faint laughter, low murmurs, and whispers that she couldn't decipher. It was as though the forest had teeth, as though the shadows themselves had tongues that taunted her. Alice froze, heart hammering. A figure emerged from the dark, moving with silent precision. Another joined, then another, until she realized the Mangole were surrounding her in a slow, deliberate circle, their movements choreographed like some ancient, terrifying ritual. She pressed herself against the cold earth, trying to disappear into the soil, but they could see her. They always could see her. The leader stepped forward, his painted face almost luminescent in the faint moonlight. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers. Then he waved a hand, and the others stopped circling. For a moment, the jungle was silent, oppressively silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves. Alice's mind raced. She didn't know what they wanted, what their rules were, or how they decided who lived or died. All she knew was fear, pure, suffocating, primal fear. Then the game began. The tribe moved closer, deliberately close enough to make her flinch, but never touching her. They whispered, chanted, and circled in a terrifying rhythm that made it impossible for Alice to predict their next move. The forest itself seemed to join in, branches brushing against her, the wind carrying voices that weren't there. She realized then that this was their power. To terrify without touching, to dominate without force, to break the mind with the night itself. Hours passed in this relentless torment. Every time she tried to move, a figure appeared ahead, blocking her path. Every time she tried to hide, she could feel the weight of eyes on her, like invisible hands pressing against her skin. The Mangole didn't speak in words she could understand. They used ritual, presence, and silence as weapons. The air was thick with tension, a tangible force that made her chest ache. At one point, she stumbled into a clearing, and the full horror of their ritual became clear. Fires burned in circles, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the trees. The tribe moved in patterns around the fire, chanting in low, hypnotic tones. Alice froze, realizing with sinking horror that she had become part of their nightly ritual, a living symbol of fear in the darkness. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only watch as the night itself seemed to warp around her, twisting reality into a nightmare. Exhaustion began to claim her. Her muscles screamed from the effort of hiding, from running, from crouching. Her mind teetered on the edge of madness. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a spark of determination remained. She had to survive. She had to find a way out of the night, out of the shadows, out of the relentless gaze of a tribe that had turned fear into an art form. As the first hint of dawn crept through the canopy, Alice realized she had survived. But the cost was immense. Her mind was frayed, her body trembling, and every nerve screamed with the memory of the night. She had learned a terrifying truth. In the Mangole territory, fear was more deadly than any weapon, and the forest itself was their accomplice. And she knew, deep down, that the night would return, as dark and merciless as ever, bringing with it shadows that would not rest until she either escaped or became part of the nightmare forever. Dawn brought little relief. The jungle, once illuminated by sunlight, now appeared more menacing than ever. Every tree, every vine, every shadow seemed to pulse with unseen eyes. Alice's body was stiff, her limbs screaming from crouching all night, yet she forced herself to move. Survival demanded action. Staying hidden meant only temporary safety. Eventually, the Mangole would find her. She had noticed patterns during the night. The faint whisper of footsteps, the direction of shadows, the rhythm of the tribe's movement around the clearing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Alice clung to it like a lifeline, using every ounce of focus to map the terrain in her mind. Every instinct screamed caution. Every nerve screamed terror. But she knew that inaction was death. She crept through the undergrowth, careful to step on soft earth, on leaves that would not betray her. Yet the jungle had its own ways of warning. Branches snapped, vines caught in her hair, and a bird's sudden cry cut through the silence. Each sound made her heart leap violently. She could feel the tribe's presence everywhere, even when she saw no one. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, guiding the hunters to her. Suddenly, she froze. A figure stepped out from behind a massive tree, silhouetted by the dim light filtering through the canopy. Alice held her breath, but the figure made no sound. It was a Mangole warrior, and he was watching her. Not with immediate aggression, but with a predator's calculation. Alice realized that direct confrontation would mean certain death. She had to avoid attention entirely, vanish into the forest like smoke. She slipped sideways into the dense undergrowth, pressing herself against a thick tree trunk. The warrior did not pursue immediately but remained where he stood, scanning the jungle with a patient, unnerving intensity. Minutes stretched like hours. Alice waited, her body locked in tense stillness, listening to the faint, rhythmic whisper of the forest. Eventually, the figure moved on, fading into the shadows, but the warning lingered. The Mangole didn't need to chase her. They could simply wait, and fear would drive her into mistakes. Alice pressed forward, deeper into the jungle. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at her, yet she knew that moving cautiously, silently, was the only chance she had. Every step was calculated, every breath measured, and yet, despite her care, the jungle itself seemed to conspire against her. Roots twisted underfoot, mud clung to her shoes, and the thick foliage slowed her progress. She could feel the eyes of the tribe at every turn, imagining their presence even when she saw nothing. Hours passed in a tense crawl through the green labyrinth. She stumbled upon a small stream, a gift in the unforgiving forest. She drank greedily, savoring the brief moment of relief, but even here, the water seemed tainted with the ever-present dread. The reflections of leaves rippling in the current reminded her of eyes, countless eyes, watching from the canopy above. The jungle was no longer just a place. It had become a sentient prison. By midday, Alice realized she had reached the edge of the first real danger zone, a section of forest where the Mangole were less active, at least from what she could sense. It offered a temporary reprieve, a chance to breathe, to think, to plan. But the brief calm was deceptive. Every instinct screamed that she had only delayed the inevitable. Her first attempt at escape was a mixture of progress and terror. Every shadow that shifted in her periphery made her flinch. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the approach of hunters. Her mind, exhausted and frayed, began to imagine things. Whispers carried on the wind, branches bending as though they had fingers, eyes appearing on every tree. It was a forest alive with fear, and she was trapped within it. That night, Alice knew she would not rest. She had survived her first real encounter with the Mangole and had managed to slip through their immediate presence. But the forest had made it clear. Freedom was not given. It had to be taken through cunning, courage, and constant vigilance. Every rustle, every shadow, every whisper was a reminder that the tribe's game had only just begun. As she pressed herself against a tree trunk to sleep, every sound of the night pressed against her. The hoot of an owl, the call of an unseen animal, the subtle movements of the jungle itself. And beneath it all, she could feel it. The knowledge that the Mangole were never far, and that tonight, like every night before, the darkness would be her adversary, her prison, and her test. Alice drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, one hand gripping a jagged branch, one eye open, listening for the first rustle that might signal pursuit. She had taken her first steps toward survival, but the forest and the Mangole had made it clear. The true terror had only just begun. Alice had learned something crucial. The jungle was never truly empty. Even when the Mangole were out of sight, their presence lingered like a cold fog, wrapping around her mind, testing her resolve. Her first attempt at escape had brought a temporary reprieve, but the forest made one thing abundantly clear. Tonight, she would not move freely. As night fell again, the jungle transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. Trees that had seemed ordinary in the day became twisted, monstrous shapes. Vines curled like serpents, roots snaked across the ground like grasping fingers. Every rustle, every whisper of wind, carried 100 imagined dangers, and Alice's mind teetered on the edge of terror. She had hoped to find a safer place to rest, to conserve her strength. Instead, she stumbled into a natural trap, a narrow valley encased in steep, jagged cliffs. The air was thick and damp, the scent of moss and decay almost suffocating. As she crept forward, she realized, with a sinking dread, that she was walking into a predator's maze. The Mangole knew this terrain intimately. She did not. Then she heard it. A faint snap, almost imperceptible, followed by silence. Her stomach dropped. Somewhere, just beyond the dense foliage, someone was moving, carefully, deliberately. Alice froze, heart hammering, listening to the slight shifting of leaves. She realized she could not run. The valley trapped her, every path likely leading back into the hunter's hands. Shadows began to move in the periphery of her vision. Figures flitted between the trees, too quick, too silent, too deliberate. She could not tell how many there were. One? Several? The forest itself seemed alive with their presence. Every instinct screamed, hide, move, survive. But the space was narrow, claustrophobic. She had no choice but to keep advancing, step by cautious step. The Mangole emerged from the darkness in the distance, their movements choreographed, almost ritualistic. They weren't charging or attacking. They were herding her, shaping her path like a game of terrifying precision. Alice realized with icy clarity that this was not random. The hunters used the forest as a weapon, turning every shadow, every tree, every natural obstacle into a trap designed to drive fear into the prey. Hours passed. She twisted through narrow paths, slipped across slippery roots, and climbed jagged rocks. Every step was calculated to avoid detection, every breath measured to avoid drawing attention. Yet even in the silent stretches, she felt them. The eyes that never blinked, the bodies that moved without sound, the cold sense that the jungle itself conspired against her. At one point, she thought she saw a way out, a faint line of moonlight cutting through the dense canopy, suggesting a ridge leading beyond the valley. Relief surged briefly, only to be crushed moments later. A Mangole warrior stepped into her path, appearing out of nowhere, as if the jungle had conjured him from shadows. Alice froze, her heart racing violently. She dared not breathe, dared not move. The figure observed her for an agonizing moment, then disappeared as silently as he had come, forcing her onward. The night stretched endlessly. The jungle, already suffocating, seemed to grow darker, thicker, more oppressive. The Mangole were relentless, herding her like a ghost through a nightmare landscape. Each rustle of leaves, each faint snap, became a thunderclap of terror in her mind. Sleep was impossible. Rest was a luxury she could not afford. Hours later, she reached a small clearing at the center of the valley. A thin stream of moonlight illuminated a patch of ground, but even here, there was no safety. The shadows were alive. The figures of the tribe lurked just beyond the light, patient, silent, waiting. Alice realized that she could not escape through force or speed. Only cunning, observation, and patience might give her even a faint chance of survival. As she crouched in the clearing, body shaking, eyes darting to every shadow, a realization settled into her bones. The Mangole did not need to strike directly to dominate her. The terror they inflicted, the relentless psychological pursuit, was enough to bend her will, to break her spirit, to make the forest itself her prison. The night closed around her like a shroud. Every whisper of leaves, every shadow that shifted, every faint glimmer of movement became a blade pressed against her mind. She could not rest. She could not flee. She could only survive, minute by minute, step by step, through fear, through cunning, through sheer determination to remain alive in a forest that seemed intent on consuming her entirely. As dawn finally began to creep through the canopy, Alice allowed herself a brief, shivering sigh. She had survived another night, but the price was steep. Exhaustion had hollowed her out, terror had sharpened her senses to the point of madness, and the jungle had made one truth unmistakably clear. This nightmare would not end until the Mangole willed it so. And somewhere in the depths of the valley, hidden in the shadows, the hunters waited, patient as the forest itself, ready to continue the endless game that had claimed Alice's nights, and perhaps, one day, her freedom. The jungle had become a prison with no walls, a living maze designed to crush the mind before the body. Alice moved cautiously, every step measured, every breath a test of endurance. Her muscles ached from the relentless climb through jagged roots and slippery moss-covered rocks. Her clothes were torn and caked with mud, the scratches on her arms and legs burning with pain. Every inch of her was raw, exposed, yet she could not stop. Survival demanded vigilance. She had learned to read the forest in a way she never thought possible. Every branch bent unnaturally, every trampled patch of grass, every slight disturbance in the undergrowth told a story, one of movement, of presence, of the hunters watching her from a distance. The Mangole didn't need to speak to communicate with one another. Their understanding of the forest was perfect. They could track, herd, and corner prey using nothing but instinct and an intimate knowledge of the land. Alice realized the valley was only the first trap. The jungle ahead twisted into a labyrinth of dense foliage, cliffs, and narrow ravines. Each path seemed to fold back on itself, turning the escape into a puzzle of fear. She stumbled upon makeshift snares, rudimentary but terrifyingly effective. Twigs arranged in a pattern that, when triggered, would create loud snaps or collapses. She understood immediately. These were warnings, traps meant to alert the tribe to her presence. One wrong step, one moment of panic, and they would descend like ghosts. She paused beside a thick vine, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and calculation. She could not afford mistakes, not now, not ever. The night would come again, and the darkness would be filled with the ever-present, watchful figures of the Mangole. Every sound of the forest, branches brushing against each other, the distant call of an animal, the rustle of leaves, became a signal to move with utmost care. Hours stretched like days. The canopy above thickened, blocking out what little moonlight had filtered through. Alice felt the weight of the forest pressing down, making every step a battle. Then she heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the dense foliage. She froze, heart pounding in her chest. The Mangole were close, too close. She pressed herself flat against a rock, hoping the shadows would swallow her. The footsteps passed, or so she thought. Then came the whispers. Not human words, but low, guttural sounds, almost like the forest itself was speaking. Her skin prickled. The tribe didn't need to touch her to terrify her. Their presence was enough. The whispers seemed to wrap around her mind, a psychological noose tightening with every passing second. Alice felt panic clawing at her sanity. She had no weapons, no allies, only herself and the raw instinct to survive. Her first attempt at navigating the labyrinth had brought her here, but she knew it would not be enough. The Mangole were patient. They didn't rush. They allowed fear to do the work for them, watching her strain, flinch, and falter as the forest became a living nightmare. Alice understood with icy certainty that tonight would be worse. By late afternoon, she reached a precarious ledge overlooking a narrow ravine. Below, the forest seemed to twist and writhe with shadows. She could hear the faint whispers of the tribe, closer now, weaving through the undergrowth. Alice realized that the labyrinth was not merely a physical obstacle, it was a mental one. Every turn, every path, every shadow was designed to disorient, to terrorize, to erode the mind until the body followed. A sudden movement, a branch snapping sharply nearby, made her jump violently. Alice's pulse raced. She understood then that the Mangole were guiding her, herding her through the labyrinth. Every trap she avoided, every sound she heard, every shadow she glimpsed had been orchestrated to drive her toward an endpoint of terror. And the end had not yet come. As darkness approached, the forest seemed to close in. The canopy above thickened, swallowing the last rays of sunlight. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of smoke and fire. Somewhere, deep in the jungle, she heard the low, rhythmic chanting of the tribe. It was closer now, surrounding her, invisible yet omnipresent. Alice's mind raced. She could not fight. She could not hide forever. She had to outthink the hunters, not outrun them. Pressing herself against a moss-covered wall of stone, she allowed herself a brief moment to plan. She would need to move carefully, silently, using the natural shadows of the jungle as cover. Every misstep could lead to capture, and the Mangole's patience was infinite. They would wait, watch, and continue the psychological torment until she broke. Alice understood, with a shiver, that the forest itself had become an extension of the tribe. The first night in the labyrinth would be the true test. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow became a weapon in their arsenal. Alice's body trembled. Her mind teetered on the edge, yet somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance remained. She had survived thus far. She had endured the night, the valley, and the relentless stalking. And now, she would face the labyrinth itself, the culmination of fear and cunning designed to test the limits of her mind and body. The jungle waited, patient and eternal. The Mangole waited, silent and calculating. And Alice, trembling but unbroken, took her first tentative step into the darkness of the labyrinth, where every path promised terror and every shadow whispered of survival or death. Night fell like a shroud, suffocating and absolute. The jungle, already a labyrinth of fear, seemed to shift as darkness enveloped it. Alice's eyes darted through the shadows, straining to catch any movement, any glimmer of light, any hint that the Mangole were near. Every nerve in her body screamed with awareness. Every breath she took seemed too loud, every heartbeat a drum calling hunters to her hiding place. She had learned something vital from the day. The Mangole were not merely hunters. They were strategists, experts at turning the forest into a weapon. Traps, misleading paths, false clearings. They used every element of the jungle to manipulate their prey, and Alice was acutely aware that she had been walking exactly where they wanted her to go. As she moved cautiously through a narrow, overgrown ravine, she froze. A branch snapped somewhere above her, startling a flock of birds that erupted into the night sky with a cacophony of screams. The sound echoed through the ravine, and she knew immediately someone or something had been there. She pressed herself flat against the ground, heart hammering violently. Shadows shifted along the steep walls. The jungle felt alive, as though the trees themselves were closing in. Suddenly, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. A figure perfectly still, almost blending into the darkness, just beyond a tangle of vines. Alice's mind froze. She realized she was walking into a silent ambush. The Mangole didn't need to strike openly. They could immobilize, surround, and terrify without ever making a sound. She retraced her steps as quietly as possible, trying to avoid triggering the invisible eyes watching her. The jungle was treacherous, the path uneven, and every step could betray her. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the subtle snap of twigs, and even the soft exhale of air felt amplified in the oppressive silence. The forest itself seemed to conspire against her, guiding her toward the points where danger waited. Hours passed, each moment stretching into eternity. The Mangole were always close, though she could not see them. Every shadow might conceal a hunter, every noise might herald an attack. Alice realized that this was the true nature of her torment. The terror of the unseen, the fear of being stalked by forces that moved in silence, and the knowledge that at any moment, escape could be impossible. At one point, she stumbled across a small clearing. For a fleeting moment, she thought she had found safety. Moonlight spilled across the ground, illuminating the uneven terrain and revealing no immediate threat. Relief surged, but it was short-lived. From the darkness at the edges of the clearing, shapes emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly. Figures moved with precision, silent as predators. Alice's stomach sank. She had walked into another trap, the calm before the storm. She backed into the nearest undergrowth, pressing herself against a thick tree trunk. Her mind raced, trying to predict the tribe's next move. She realized with a jolt, the Mangole weren't merely hunting her. They were teaching her the forest, shaping her movements, controlling her every decision through terror. Every choice she made was anticipated, every path she took guided. Suddenly, a low chant rose in the distance, barely audible but unmistakably human. The sound vibrated through the ground and the trees, creating a sensation in her chest that was almost physical. It was hypnotic, rhythmic, and unnerving. Alice understood immediately. The tribe was using ritual, presence, and sound as weapons. The chant was designed to break her will, disorient her, and lead her into the next part of their carefully orchestrated hunt. Her options were few. She could try to climb the steep walls of the ravine, risking a fall, or follow the twisting path through the undergrowth, knowing it might lead deeper into the trap. Every step carried immense risk, but standing still was equally dangerous. Her body trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from the acute awareness that she was a prey animal, surrounded by invisible hunters in a forest that itself had become a weapon. Hours seemed to blur together. Alice moved cautiously, silently, each movement guided by fear and instinct. The shadows shifted constantly, and the chant in the distance rose and fell like a tide, keeping her off balance, keeping her alert, keeping her terrified. Every rustle, every whisper, every faint glimmer of movement threatened to undo her. By the time she reached a narrow passage between two cliffs, dawn's first light had begun to creep into the canopy. She allowed herself a brief moment to rest, shaking and exhausted, yet painfully aware that survival required her to keep moving. The Mangole had taught her one unyielding truth. The forest and its hunters would not allow rest, not in the day, not in the night, and not until they willed it. Alice's first night in the labyrinth had ended, but the lessons of fear, patience, and observation were burned into her mind. She understood that the Mangole's game was far from over. The forest would continue to test her, the hunters would continue to stalk her, and every night would bring new terrors. And somewhere, just beyond her vision, the shadows waited, patient and eternal, for the next move of their prey. The jungle was a living nightmare, suffocating, oppressive, and full of unseen eyes. Alice moved cautiously, each step carefully placed, every breath shallow, her muscles screaming with fatigue. She had survived the valley, the labyrinth of fear, and the night of silent ambushes, but she knew the forest and the Mangole were far from finished with her. As dusk fell, the shadows deepened, blending into the blackness of the jungle. Alice's senses were sharpened to a painful edge. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every subtle shift in the undergrowth made her flinch. Her eyes darted to every shadow, her ears straining for the slightest hint of danger. But tonight, she sensed something different. A deliberate stillness in the forest, a calm that didn't promise safety but heralded calculated danger. She had just climbed over a fallen log and was navigating a narrow, rocky path when she felt it. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down, the usual chorus of insects fell silent, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals vanished. It was the kind of silence that screamed of predators lying in wait. Alice pressed herself against a rock, heart pounding violently, aware that she had entered the Mangole's deadliest hunting ground yet. Then she saw them. Figures emerged slowly from the shadows, tall, painted, moving like ghosts between the trees. They were not attacking yet. They were herding, shaping her movements, guiding her like a frightened animal. Alice realized she had stepped into another trap. This narrow path was a corridor designed for ambush. There was no room to flee. Every misstep could be fatal. Her mind raced. She needed a plan, any plan, but the forest offered no help. Rocks and roots underfoot threatened to betray her every move, and the shadows seemed to close in, pressing against her senses. The Mangole stalked her silently, using the darkness and the terrain as weapons. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and her breath caught in her throat as she tried to anticipate their next move. A sudden rustle to her left made her flinch. She froze, pressed flat against a tree. Two warriors emerged, crouched low, moving with terrifying precision. Alice realized she was surrounded on multiple sides. ***, a true ambush ***. Her mind screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The Mangole's strategy was terrifyingly simple. Control the space, isolate the prey, and let fear do the work. Alice took a shallow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Panic could be sensed, and it would betray her. She inched backward, carefully, step by step, trying to avoid snapping the undergrowth beneath her feet. The forest seemed to pulse with her terror, amplifying it, twisting it into every shadow, every whisper, every shifting shape around her. The warriors advanced slowly, deliberately. Alice realized with dawning horror that the forest itself was part of the trap. Roots twisted underfoot, cliffs rose on either side, vines blocked potential escape routes, and the path narrowed like a funnel. The ambush was total. There was no room for error. She had to outthink them, not outrun them. Her heart pounded as she scanned the immediate area. A fallen tree to her right offered a precarious but possible route upward. a climb that might take her out of the immediate trap. She knew it was risky. One slip could mean falling into the ravine below, but staying put meant capture. Summoning every ounce of strength and courage, she darted toward the tree, moving with speed and precision born of desperation. The Mangole reacted immediately. Shadows erupted around her as the hunters pursued, silent and deadly, weaving through the jungle like wraiths. Alice scrambled up the tree, roots and branches biting into her palms, her body trembling with exertion and fear. She could feel their eyes following her, their presence oppressive even when they weren't within sight. From her precarious perch, she could see the ambush corridor below. The warriors moved methodically, searching, whispering low guttural sounds that echoed unnervingly in the night air. Alice's pulse raced. She realized she had survived the ambush by a fraction. But the night was far from over. The jungle would not release her. The Mangole would continue their hunt. And now she had drawn their attention directly to herself. Hours passed as she clung to the branches, muscles screaming, eyes scanning for movement. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant animal call made her flinch. She had learned one essential truth. In the Mangole territory, survival required constant vigilance, unending courage, and the ability to endure fear beyond imagination. As dawn broke, faint light filtering through the thick canopy, Alice allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had survived her first true ambush. She had outmaneuvered the hunters, avoided capture, and climbed to safety. But exhaustion and fear had hollowed her out. She realized that this was only the beginning. The jungle had more trials in store, and the Mangole's patience was infinite. Alice's mind was already racing with the next steps. She knew she had to move to find water and food, to hide more effectively, and to continue outsmarting a tribe whose mastery of fear, strategy, and the forest itself seemed limitless. Every night would bring new terror, and every step in the forest was a test of body and mind. And somewhere in the jungle, hidden and silent, the Mangole waited, patient and eternal, ready for the next night, the next ambush, the next chance to bend the prey to their design. Alice had begun to understand a brutal truth. In the Mangole territory, danger was never announced. It moved silently, patiently, like smoke creeping through the undergrowth. Each night the jungle became a different kind of nightmare, a test designed to wear her down mentally and physically. By now, exhaustion had become a constant companion, clinging to her muscles and clouding her mind. Yet she knew she could not stop. Stopping meant death. The forest ahead was darker, denser, and more treacherous than any area she had encountered before. The canopy had thickened, swallowing the moonlight and turning every step into a blind gamble. She moved cautiously, feeling the ground for roots and hidden hollows, aware that the Mangole could spring another ambush at any moment. Every instinct screamed that she was being watched, stalked, hunted, but she pressed on. Survival demanded it. Hours into the night, she reached a narrow gorge flanked by jagged cliffs. Mist rose from a thin stream at the bottom, curling through the rocks like fingers seeking her. Alice paused, listening. The jungle was alive with movement, but subtle, soft footfalls that seemed almost synchronized, whispers in the distance, shadows shifting in impossible ways. The Mangole were here. They always were. As she stepped carefully along a precarious ledge, the first trap sprang. A hidden root, camouflaged by moss, twisted underfoot and sent her sliding into a shallow depression. She landed hard, pain shooting through her ribs and scraping her palms. The fall was minor, but the sound echoed through the gorge like a gunshot. She froze, heart hammering, listening to the faint rustle of movement. The hunters had noticed. Figures emerged from the mist, silent, deliberate, moving like phantoms. Alice pressed herself against the cliff wall, trying to blend into the shadows. She could feel the weight of their gaze, as though the forest itself were alive, focusing on her every tremor. The Mangole didn't need to attack immediately. Fear was enough. The psychological snare was as deadly as any physical trap. The forest seemed to close around her. Every rock, every branch, Every shadow became a tool of terror. She realized with chilling clarity that this gorge was designed as a kill zone, a corridor in which the Mangole could isolate and corner prey with precision. Every instinct screamed to move, to flee, but movement could draw attention, and one wrong step could trigger another trap. She inched forward, careful, deliberate, sliding along the moss-covered rocks, listening intently. A sudden snap behind her made her flinch violently. The forest seemed to vibrate with sound. Shadows shifted, but she saw nothing. Her mind raced. Were they advancing, or was it another psychological tactic designed to make her doubt her senses? The Mangole's methods were subtle, relentless, and terrifyingly effective. Hours passed in tense, slow crawling along the gorge. She could feel the eyes of the hunters in every shadow. At one point, she slipped on wet moss, catching herself just before falling into the stream below. The sound of water splashing was enough to trigger a movement in the shadows. Figures appeared on the ridge above, silently observing. She realized then. The Mangole had trapped her in a web of fear. An escape would require cunning, timing, and sheer endurance. By midnight, she found a small overhang, a tiny sanctuary amid the snare. She pressed herself against the rock, shivering, exhausted, and allowed herself a moment of rest. Her muscles trembled. Her mind teetered on the edge of collapse, but she forced herself to focus. Every night, every step, every shadow was a lesson. And every night, the jungle and the Mangole seemed to learn more about her too. She had survived the hunter's snare, but at a steep cost. Fear had hollowed her out, and exhaustion threatened to claim her. Yet a spark of determination remained. She would need all of it. For tomorrow, or rather the next night, the forest and its hunters would return, ready to test her again, pushing her to the edge of endurance. And somewhere, just beyond the mist, the Mangole waited, patient, silent, eternal, watching the prey they had meticulously cornered, shaping her path like smoke in the wind, guiding her deeper into the nightmare of the jungle. The night descended again, thick and unrelenting, as if the darkness itself were a living thing pressing down upon Alice. She had survived valley traps, ambushes, labyrinthine corridors, and the hunter's snare, but tonight felt different. The jungle seemed to hum with a deliberate intensity, every rustle, every whisper magnified into a signal of unseen menace. Her exhaustion was crushing, but she knew that slowing down was not an option. Alice moved cautiously along a narrow ridge above a hidden ravine. The fog clung to her legs and arms, chilling her through her soaked, tattered clothes. Every step was a careful calculation. A single slip could send her tumbling into the rocks below. And worse, the Mangole were near. She could feel their presence like a weight pressing against her mind, though she could see none of them. Shadows shifted in impossible patterns, making her doubt her own eyes. Hours passed in agonizing silence, broken only by the faint whispers of the wind and the occasional distant call of a nocturnal animal. Alice realized that this was no longer a forest. It was a predator, alive and deliberate, and she was its prey. The Mangole had trained the jungle itself to hunt. Roots twisted underfoot, vines blocked possible escape routes, and cliffs and ravines funneled her movement. Every choice she made seemed guided, anticipated, manipulated. Suddenly, a snap echoed to her left. Alice froze, heart hammering violently, eyes scanning the darkness. The sound had come from somewhere in the undergrowth. A branch bent too far, a hidden rock shifted. Her pulse leapt. The Mangole were close, impossibly close, though still unseen. She pressed herself flat against the ridge wall, barely breathing, muscles taut with fear. A faint glow appeared ahead. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating a patch of uneven ground. Alice moved toward it cautiously, seeking higher footing. The forest seemed to shift with her movement, shadows stretching and writhing, as though alive. And then she heard it, the low, rhythmic chanting of the tribe, faint at first, then closer, echoing through the trees. It was hypnotic, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. The Mangole were orchestrating her every step. She realized she had walked into a corridor of fear. The jungle walls narrowed, the undergrowth thickened, and every shadow seemed to twist with unseen eyes. Figures emerged from the darkness, silhouettes barely distinguishable from the night. They moved slowly, circling her, driving her forward. This was the true power of the Mangole. Not to attack immediately, but to terrify, to manipulate, to break the mind. Alice's mind raced. She needed a plan, but her options were limited. The forest itself funneled her movements. Escape paths were illusions. One misstep could trigger traps, alert the hunters, or leave her exposed. She inched forward, step by trembling step, heart pounding, every nerve screaming in protest. The chanting grew louder. The shadows shifted closer. She could feel the hunters around her, stalking silently, like predators moving through fog. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but the terrain offered no safe path. A sudden, sharp rustle behind her made her whip around. Figures flitted between the trees, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. The jungle itself seemed to move with them, bending shadows, shifting branches, guiding her along the path the hunters had chosen. Hours passed in tense crawling and careful navigation. Exhaustion was taking its toll. Her muscles burned, her lungs ached, and fear gnawed relentlessly at her mind. But Alice forced herself to continue, focusing only on the next step, the next breath, the next movement. Survival demanded it. By the time dawn approached, pale light filtering through the thick canopy, Alice had reached the edge of a small plateau. She collapsed against a tree, trembling, gasping for air. Her body was raw, bruised, and trembling from fatigue, but she had survived another night. The jungle was quiet now, but she knew the Mangole had not gone. They were always watching, always patient, always ready. Alice had endured 10 nights in the Mangole territory. Every hour had been a battle against fear, exhaustion, and the relentless, invisible hunters that stalked her through the shadows. She had learned a crucial lesson. In this forest, survival depended not on strength, but on cunning, endurance, and the ability to withstand terror beyond imagining. And somewhere in the dense jungle, the Mangole waited, patient as ever, ready for the next night, the next test, the next move in a game that had no mercy and no end until they decided it was over. The jungle was silent in a way that pressed against Alice's chest, a heavy, almost tangible pressure that made each breath a labor. She had survived 10 nights of relentless pursuit, ambushes, labyrinthine traps, and psychological torment. Yet she knew this night would not be like the others. The Mangole had escalated their game. The forest itself seemed to hum with anticipation, shadows shifting with an intelligence she had learned to fear. Alice crept along a narrow trail between dense foliage, alert to every subtle sound. Her muscles were stiff, her body aching from bruises, scrapes, and exhaustion. Each step was deliberate, calculated. One misstep could betray her presence. She had learned to anticipate the Mangole's methods. Their silent stalking, their psychological manipulation, their ability to shape the forest itself into a trap. Then she saw it, a subtle shift in the undergrowth. A vine stretched unnaturally across the path, and she realized too late that it was part of a snare. Her foot caught, and she stumbled, sliding forward into a shallow pit cleverly concealed by leaves and loose branches. The impact was jarring, pain shooting through her arms and legs. Her heart raced as she realized she had fallen into the first real trap intended to capture her physically. Figures emerged from the shadows. The Mangole were patient, circling her, silent, like predators observing their prey. Alice pressed herself against the side of the pit, trembling, eyes darting for escape. The snare had not killed her, but it had immobilized her enough to put her directly in the hunter's path. She could feel their presence all around, the jungle itself amplifying her terror. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of calculating eyes. The forest was alive with movement, subtle and deliberate. Branches shifted, leaves rustled, and the faint, rhythmic chanting of the Mangole filled the air. The hunters weren't attacking immediately. They were studying her, testing her reactions, driving her deeper into fear. Alice's pulse thundered in her ears. Every instinct screamed for action, but every movement could trigger another trap or draw the hunters closer. Minutes stretched like hours. The Mangole circled, patient and deliberate. Alice examined the pit. It was shallow but lined with sharp roots and uneven rocks, dangerous to climb out recklessly. She had to act with precision, timing, and calm, though fear threatened to overwhelm her. Slowly, carefully, she began to climb, testing each handhold, shifting her weight with painstaking attention. The slightest slip would leave her exposed. The hunters moved closer, silent as the shadows themselves. Alice felt the oppressive weight of their gaze, even without seeing them directly. She realized that the forest was part of the trap. The canopy above shifted just enough to block light, the ground below twisted with roots and stones, and the snare she had fallen into had funneled her precisely to the location they wanted. Every detail had been orchestrated to push her to the edge of terror. She reached the edge of the pit, grasping a sturdy root to pull herself up. Pain lanced through her arms, but she forced herself to continue. From her vantage point, she could see vague figures moving among the trees. Mangole warriors, patient, deliberate, calculating every movement. The jungle echoed with subtle cues designed to manipulate her perception, to make her doubt every shadow, every step, every breath. Alice crawled to the next patch of dense undergrowth, pressing herself flat against the soil. She allowed herself a few heartbeats to breathe and assess her surroundings. She had survived the first true trap, but the jungle had made one thing clear: the Mangole's methods were escalating. The psychological games were no longer enough. They were now blending physical danger, cunning traps, and relentless pursuit. As night deepened, Alice realized she had only survived by inches, by instinct, by patience, and by fear-driven focus. The forest seemed to close around her, the shadows alive with movement, the hunters ever patient, always calculating. She had learned an essential truth. In the Mangole territory, survival required complete vigilance, unmatched cunning, and the ability to endure terror at the edge of human endurance. By dawn, she had found a small ledge to rest, body trembling from exertion and fear. Her mind was frayed, but her determination burned brighter than ever. She had survived a trap designed to physically ensnare her. She had survived, but she knew the Mangole would not stop. They would escalate further. Every night, every step, every shadow would be more dangerous, more cunning, more terrifying. Alice's eyes scanned the dense jungle. Somewhere, the Mangole waited, patient as the forest itself, ready to continue the hunt, ready to test her again, ready to shape the darkness into an unending nightmare. And Alice, trembling, exhausted, yet unbroken, prepared herself for the next night, knowing that her survival depended on endurance, vigilance, and sheer will. The jungle at night had become a living entity, a sentient predator that breathed around Alice, closing in with every step she took. By now, she had survived 10 nights of terror, a labyrinth of traps, and the hunter's snare. But tonight, she sensed something different in the air. A tension, thick and deliberate, like the forest itself was holding its breath. She had been moving cautiously along a narrow ridge, branches scraping against her skin, roots twisting underfoot, every step measured with painstaking care. But the Mangole's presence was undeniable. Shadows shifted in unnatural patterns, whispers carried on the wind, and faint, rhythmic chanting echoed through the trees. The tribe was orchestrating something. She could feel it, a premeditated cruelty beyond imagination. Suddenly, the forest seemed to close around her. The path narrowed sharply, funneling her into a gorge with sheer cliffs on either side. Roots and vines blocked any easy escape, while uneven rocks threatened to betray her steps. Alice realized with a sickening certainty. She was walking into a fully orchestrated ambush. Every element, the narrow path, the shadows, the hidden pitfalls, was designed to corner her completely. Figures emerged silently from the darkness, moving like ghosts between trees. Their painted faces glimmered faintly in the moonlight, their eyes unreadable and predatory. Alice froze, pressing herself against the cliff wall. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, but the terrain offered no way out. The Mangole were experts at controlling space, shaping prey behavior, and forcing victims into zones of terror. A low chant began, rising from the shadows. The sound was hypnotic, ritualistic, and utterly disorienting. Alice felt her mind reel as the rhythm penetrated her thoughts, forcing her to focus on survival while simultaneously draining her will. The forest seemed to vibrate with the chant, the undergrowth itself pressing in on her, guiding her movements along a path. A fear the hunters had laid out. She moved cautiously, step by step, testing the ground for hidden snares, watching for sudden shifts in the shadows. But the Mangole's ambush was layered. Roots bent unnaturally, loose rocks threatened to give way, and the path funneled her into a narrow clearing. Figures flitted just beyond the light, silent and patient, guiding her toward the center of their trap without making a sound. Her heart raced. The forest was no longer just a hiding place. It had become a weapon in the hands of the hunters. Every shadow could conceal a Mangole. Every whisper of wind could signal movement. Alice's senses strained to their absolute limits. She understood that a single mistake would be fatal. The trap was designed not just to capture, but to break her mind with terror. As she approached the clearing, the full scope of the ambush became apparent. The Mangole had positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, invisible yet omnipresent. Vines were strung at ankle and knee height, roots placed to trip, loose rocks positioned to tumble at the slightest misstep. Every detail of the environment had been manipulated. She was the centerpiece of a meticulously planned hunt. Alice pressed herself against a tree, trembling, her body aching from exhaustion. She realized that this night's trial would push her beyond anything she had endured. The Mangole didn't need to strike with weapons. The combination of psychological terror, physical traps, and the suffocating jungle itself was enough to make prey falter. She had to rely on all of her wits, her endurance, and her cunning to survive. Minutes stretched into hours. The Mangole remained patient, circling silently. Their presence felt more than seen. Alice tested the path ahead, inching along carefully, avoiding snares, dodging roots, and stepping lightly on loose stones. Each step was a calculated risk. The forest seemed to pulse around her, alive with anticipation. Every shadow a weapon, every whisper a threat. Suddenly, a figure darted across the clearing. Alice froze. The forest seemed to amplify her terror, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes. The Mangole were guiding her movements, herding her like an animal through a maze of fear and traps. She realized that she had to move quickly but silently, think strategically, and use the environment itself against them if she wanted to survive. By the first light of dawn, Alice had navigated the ambush without triggering the most dangerous traps. Her body was trembling, her mind frayed, but she had survived. She pressed herself against the base of a tree, listening to the jungle come alive with the sounds of morning, knowing that the Mangole were still out there, still patient, still orchestrating the next night's hunt. She had survived the orchestrated ambush, but the lesson was clear. In the Mangole territory, fear was a weapon, the forest was a trap, and every night would test her limits further. And somewhere in the dense jungle, the hunters waited, invisible, eternal, ready to escalate the terror even more. Alice shivered, exhausted, but alive, and she knew that tomorrow night, the nightmare would return, more cunning, more deliberate, and even more deadly. Night had fallen again, thick and suffocating, as if the darkness itself were a living predator pressing against Alice from all sides. Her body was raw, bruised, and trembling from days of relentless pursuit, exhaustion, and terror. But the forest allowed no pause, no mercy. She had survived ambushes, labyrinths, and psychological traps. But the Mangole were escalating. Tonight, the danger was not only in fear, it was in death itself. Alice moved cautiously along a narrow gorge, her bare hands gripping jagged roots and slippery rocks. Every step had to be precise, One miscalculation could send her falling into a ravine or trigger the hidden mechanisms of the hunter's traps. She could feel the presence of the Mangole everywhere, though she could see nothing. The forest seemed alive with anticipation, shadows stretching unnaturally, twisting as if guiding her movement. Suddenly, the earth beneath her foot gave way slightly. Alice froze, realizing she had stepped onto a cleverly concealed trap, a pit lined with sharpened stakes hidden beneath a thin layer of leaves and debris. Her pulse raced violently as she instinctively leapt backward, narrowly avoiding the deadly spikes. She pressed herself against a nearby cliff, heart hammering, aware that the Mangole had guided her into precisely this corridor. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall, painted, silent as phantoms. They moved with uncanny precision, herding her toward a series of natural obstacles that had been rigged to function as lethal extensions of the forest itself. The Mangole didn't need weapons to kill. The jungle had become their instrument. Roots, vines, cliffs, loose rocks. All had been manipulated to punish, trap, and terrify. The rhythmic chanting began, faint at first, then rising in intensity. Alice felt her mind reel under its hypnotic cadence. The combination of exhaustion, fear, and the unnatural rhythm of the chant began to cloud her judgment. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement became amplified into a threat. The Mangole were orchestrating her panic, her hesitation, and her terror, using the jungle itself as a weapon. She pressed forward along the narrow path, every step calculated. Roots twisted underfoot, loose stones threatened to slide into the ravine, and hidden pits loomed just beyond the next bend. Alice realized with horror that the Mangole had not only studied her movements, they had anticipated them. Every instinct she relied upon to survive had been considered, tested, and manipulated. Then she saw it. A rope and stick contraption stretched across the path, invisible in the darkness. One wrong step, and it would trigger a cascade of falling logs and swinging stakes. Alice's heart raced as she carefully examined the mechanism. Using a branch, she nudged the device, watching the subtle tension release without activating it. The trap was designed for a moment exactly like this, to provoke panic, to force mistakes, to punish the prey for surviving too long. Her body was shaking violently from exhaustion and fear. The forest itself seemed to pulse, alive with intent, guiding her through the lethal corridor. She realized that the Mangole didn't need to engage her directly. Their tools, traps, and manipulation of the environment were enough to make survival a razor-thin margin. Every breath, every step, every heartbeat was a delicate negotiation with death. Hours passed as Alice navigated the gorge. She slipped, almost triggering another snare, and narrowly avoided a concealed pit. The hunter's shadows flitted along the edges of her vision, silent, patient, eternal. The forest echoed with the subtle hum of the Mangole's influence, their presence felt in every rock, root, and leaf. By the time she reached a relatively safe overhang to rest, her muscles screamed, her mind was frayed, and her resolve had been tested beyond anything she had imagined. Alice understood one thing with brutal clarity. In the Mangole territory, death was never instantaneous. It was prolonged, psychological, and omnipresent. Survival depended on cunning, vigilance, and the ability to endure a terror that consumed body, mind, and spirit alike. As she pressed herself against the rock, shivering and exhausted, she listened to the jungle's subtle movements. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows, the Mangole waited, patient as the forest itself, ready to escalate the hunt again, to test her limits, and to push her to the edge of endurance. Alice closed her eyes for a brief, trembling moment, knowing that the night had not ended, and that tomorrow or the next moment would bring yet another trial of fear, cunning, and survival. The jungle had grown darker, almost sentient in its intensity. Alice's body was battered, her mind frayed from days of terror, starvation, and relentless pursuit. Each night, the Mangole had escalated their hunt, blending physical traps with psychological torment, and tonight, the 14th night, the forest itself seemed poised for a final, ultimate trial. Alice moved carefully along a narrow ridge, where roots twisted like serpents and jagged rocks threatened to throw her into the abyss below. Mist clung to the ground, curling around her feet like ghostly fingers, chilling her to the bone. Every sound, an animal's distant call, the subtle sway of a vine, the creak of a branch, was amplified into a signal of imminent danger. She felt the hunter's presence everywhere, though they were invisible. Shadows shifted in ways that defied logic, suggesting more eyes than her mind could count. She knew that she had entered the heart of the Mangole territory, the section of the forest where the hunter's mastery of fear and the environment was absolute. The jungle itself seemed alive with intent, every tree, vine, and rock aligned to manipulate her movement, to test her nerves, and to maximize terror. Each step she took was an intricate negotiation with the lethal forest, and she was acutely aware that a single misstep could end her life. The narrow ridge opened into a clearing, faintly illuminated by moonlight breaking through the thick canopy. Alice moved cautiously, scanning the shadows for movement, listening for the slightest sound. A faint rustling in the undergrowth made her heart leap. From the darkness, figures emerged, tall, painted, silent as phantoms. Their movements were deliberate, ritualistic, as if choreographed to terrorize rather than strike immediately. The chanting began again, low and hypnotic, vibrating through the ground and the trees. Alice's mind quaked under the weight of exhaustion and fear. The Mangole had perfected a method of torment that attacked body, mind, and spirit simultaneously. The snare traps, the ambush corridors, and now this a psychological crucible designed to push her to the brink of madness. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the terrain left no room for error. Loose stones, hidden roots, and twisted vines channeled her into the center of the clearing, where the Mangole waited, patient and silent. She realized with chilling clarity. They had guided her here deliberately, shaping her path for maximum fear and psychological pressure. Alice crouched, trembling, trying to plan her next move. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow alive. Figures flitted between the trees, remaining unseen but palpably close. One misstep could trigger another hidden trap, expose her to capture, or push her off the cliffs surrounding the clearing. The forest itself had become an extension of the hunter's will, a living weapon crafted for her torment. Hours passed in agonizing tension. The Mangole's movements were imperceptible, their presence constant. The jungle seemed to pulse, the chanting rising and falling rhythmically, lulling her into near hysteria. Every fiber of her being screamed for action, for flight, but any movement had to be precise, deliberate, and calculated, or it would be her last. Alice's mind raced. She reviewed every lesson from the previous nights, the hunter's snare, the silent ambushes, the labyrinthine traps. Tonight, survival would demand unimaginable cunning, perfect timing, and the ability to endure fear beyond reason. She inched along the edge of the clearing, testing her footing, listening to the faintest cues from the jungle, feeling the invisible eyes guiding her movements like a puppeteer. By the first pale light of dawn, Alice had navigated the clearing without triggering the Mangole's final traps. Her body shook violently from exhaustion, her muscles screamed, and her mind teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet she had survived. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She had learned the rhythm of the jungle, the subtle cues of the hunters, and the delicate balance between terror and action. But the lesson was brutal and clear. The Mangole were patient, eternal, and always prepared to escalate the terror. Survival required more than courage. It demanded perfection, cunning, and the indomitable will to endure the impossible. Alice pressed herself against the base of a tree, trembling but resolute. Somewhere in the dense forest, the Mangole waited, silent, invisible, eternal. She knew that tomorrow night, the 15th night, would be the ultimate test, the final trial, where her wits, courage, and resilience would be pushed to their absolute limits. And she understood, with icy certainty, that only by confronting the heart of fear itself could she hope to survive and escape. The 15th night fell with an oppressive weight, darker than any Alice had known. The jungle seemed alive, aware, and every shadow moved with intent. Her body was battered, her mind frayed, her spirit tested beyond imagination. Yet she carried a spark of defiance that no Mangole trap or jungle terror had yet extinguished. Tonight, she would face the culmination of all the horrors the forest and its hunters had unleashed. Alice moved cautiously along a narrow gorge, the cliffs rising sharply on either side. Every instinct screamed at her to remain still, but she knew the forest itself would funnel her toward the hunters if she hesitated. She could sense them everywhere. The silent figures lurking just beyond the tree line, the faint rustle of leaves, the almost imperceptible shift of branches in the wind. The Mangole had orchestrated this night down to the last detail. As she entered a clearing, the forest seemed to close in. Figures emerged slowly from the darkness, their painted faces glowing faintly in the pale moonlight. Their chanting began, a hypnotic, rhythmic murmur that reverberated through the earth, designed to weaken resolve and instill terror. The traps were no longer hidden. The entire clearing had been rigged as a final snare. Roots, vines, and rocks had been arranged to channel her movements, to leave her exposed at the exact moment they would strike. Alice pressed herself against a tree, trembling violently. Her mind raced as she recalled everything she had learned over the past 14 nights. The hunter's psychology, the manipulation of space, the rhythm of fear. If she was to survive, she would have to outthink the hunters completely, using the forest against them. One step forward, carefully, testing the ground. A vine snapped slightly, but she froze and held her breath. The Mangole's eyes were everywhere, yet they did not strike immediately. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. She inched forward again, moving with silent precision, relying on every ounce of knowledge and instinct she had accumulated. Suddenly, one figure lunged from the shadows, attempting to block her path. Alice reacted instinctively, ducking low and rolling across the uneven ground. She grabbed a fallen branch, using it as a lever to push herself over the figure, narrowly avoiding capture. The jungle itself seemed to aid her in that moment. The uneven terrain, the low-hanging branches, even the wind seemed to conceal her movements. The Mangole recoiled briefly, regrouping, and the chanting rose, more intense, more hypnotic. Alice realized that the final night was not only about physical survival, it was about outlasting their psychological onslaught. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle trembling, every nerve on fire, but her mind sharpened. She focused entirely on the rhythm of the jungle, the subtle cues in the shadows, the timing of the hunter's movements. Hours passed in tense, precise maneuvering. Alice darted between trees, climbed over roots, and slid down rocky slopes. The Mangole followed, their patience unbroken, but her understanding of the jungle now rivaled theirs. Where they attempted to funnel her into traps, she twisted her movements, slipping through narrow gaps, ducking beneath branches, and using her fear as a guide rather than a weapon against herself. Finally, as dawn broke, a narrow ridge appeared ahead. Beyond it, she glimpsed open land, a distant river glimmering in the first rays of the sun. The Mangole hesitated at the edge of the forest, unwilling to pursue her beyond the jungle that gave them their advantage. Alice surged forward, using the last reserves of strength in her body. She ran, leaping over roots and rocks, ignoring the searing pain in her limbs. Every step took her farther from the jungle and closer to freedom. When she finally crossed the edge of the forest and reached the river, Alice collapsed, gasping, shivering, and sobbing. The Mangole had not followed her. Their domain ended where their control of the jungle ended. She was alive. She had endured 15 nights of terror, traps, and psychological torment. She had survived because she had learned to read the forest, anticipate the hunters, and endure fear beyond human limits. As the sun rose over the river, illuminating the open land beyond, Alice stood, trembling but resolute. She had escaped the Mangole territory, the nightmare of the jungle, and the relentless hunters who had stalked her so meticulously. Her body bore the marks of survival, bruises, cuts, exhaustion, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had faced the forest itself, faced the hunter's cunning, and emerged alive. Alice's journey had been one of terror, endurance, and unyielding will. The Mangole remained in their jungle, eternal, patient, and deadly, but she had survived. And as she looked back at the dark canopy, the whispering shadows, and the stillness of the trees, she understood a truth that would remain with her forever. Fear can be a weapon, but courage, cunning, and the refusal to surrender can triumph even against the most relentless darkness. The jungle receded behind her, a nightmare she had conquered, and for the first time in 15 nights, Alice felt the fragile, trembling, yet undeniable relief of freedom. The story ends here, with Alice escaping the Mangole Jungle, battered but alive, and having endured the ultimate test of fear, endurance, and cunning.